The rand's depreciation against the US dollar when it became apparent that Republican Donald Trump was set to triumph in the US election is illustrative of how volatile the currency can be when it comes to external influences. As the dollar has stabilised since that time, so too has the rand gained some ground. So how important is it for South African investors to hedge against potential market volatility following the US election? More so because US economic policy looks increasingly uncertain and could have a bearing on South Africa's fortunes. Well, to share his insights on this matter, I'm joined by Justiné Brophy. He's the CEO of boutique asset manager AnBro. Thank you very much, Justiné, for joining us. So the US election is but one example of outside factors influencing the value of the local currency here in South Africa, which has all sorts of implications for the value of goods and services in the country, more specifically imported inflation. Just speak to us about this reality and why it's so significant for South African economic actors.
Sure. From a perspective of being a South African, everything we look at as South Africans and purchase has some sort of imported inflation impact, whether it's the fuel in your vehicle, your medical costs, or a lot of the other consumer goods we all use and have in our daily lives. So the cost of these things as a South African tend to move quite in line with the currency. And the weaker the currency gets, the higher these goods get. Now, in terms of the rand, with the rand being so volatile, we are in the early phases of the Trump transition from Biden to Trump. We have about 3 months left, and he's only going to be president in mid-January. But in the interim, I think there's going to be a lot of volatility around the rand while we wait to see what policies of his will actually start to emerge as stronger.
Yeah, so markets are expected Donald Trump to follow through on his economic policy plans in terms of tax cuts and the imposition of trade tariffs, among other things. What are the expected impacts for emerging markets like South Africa?
Well, the concern around tariffs is obviously it makes goods more expensive. That leads to an increase in inflation over time in the States, which means that their current interest rate cutting cycle might be slower. If that is slower, the US dollar will stay stronger. And therefore, for emerging markets that have a dollar link or a dollar export position, you are in a position where your exports look better if they're in dollars, but your imports remain more expensive. Now, what also tends to happen is we've kind of to look at US debt, and the yields on US debt are going to stay higher over time if he has this inflationary type policy, which means US bond yields remain high. This has an impact for South Africa in that with our bonds, if one considers the US to be, almost the risk-free bond in the market, if one looks at SA, we have to add our sovereign risk rating, which makes our bonds more expensive, which makes it more expensive to pay back for the government in terms of South African debt.
Yeah.
So looking at that may lead to interest rates, a cutting cycle of interest rates being slower.
Yes, I was going to say, Justiné, of course, it's not only, developments in the United States that are going to impact or could impact South Africa, but we're also in a very tricky geopolitical environment as well.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of unique factors where South Africa's economy is and where the US economy is, for example, and South Africa within its BRICS alliance as well. If we look at the trade dispute between the US and China, this is going to have a potential impact on the Chinese demand for commodities in terms of goods and services. South Africa would be impacted by that. If this does have an impact or slows down any kind of commodity demand by China, this would then have an impact for, South Africa being exporter of those commodities.
So given the concerns and possible threats that we've outlined in our conversation, what is it that South African investors can do to guard against the volatility that could arise in our local markets and more specifically in terms of the rand?
So the first thing I would say is, all countries, particularly the biggest sort of market in the world being the US at present, when there's a change in leadership, I think there's obviously going to be a lot of reaction, a lot of positive, a lot of negative from different sides, and a lot of concern about the volatility we see in markets initially. I think all things tend to trend over time back to results in companies, results in economies, and results of policies. As a South African investor, I think it's always important to have a balanced approach, to speak to your particular advisor, but having exposure to an economy like the US and global economies, where a lot of the big US companies that we all buy and use are available, I think over time will always stand you in good stead and try to protect you from that imported inflation hedge. of any investor. It's just important to look at this and go, we are in a short-term volatile period. We will know more as we move towards the inauguration and post-inauguration. But I think it's always important to have a balanced approach and try and hedge that imported inflation. And that's what our sort of approach has been as AnBro in our investment products.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying basically speaks to diversification, not just of asset classes, but of geographies as well, you know, not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Absolutely. And being able to do that, you know, in a scenario where there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, I think it's comforting to investors to know that you can invest in offshore, and there's also a recovering South African story that's starting to happen as well. Don't forget, you know, barring a tariff change on South African imported goods into the States, we are very important suppliers into the US steel industry. You know, South Africa is a big supplier of chrome, manganese, and vanadium, and there's several stocks in South Africa that could benefit from that if there's no tariff sort of implication. So being a South African investor, one has to be sort of alert to the fact that there are opportunities in South Africa and also abroad.
Indeed. Justin, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for your insights. That was Justiné Brophy. He's the CEO of boutique asset manager AnBro.